Resuming debate, the honourable member for Edmonton West.
Thanks, Madam Speaker. To start, I'll mention I'm sharing my time with my colleague from Renfrew, Nipissing, Pembroke. I'm pleased to rise to talk on Budget 24, which the government has labelled Fairness for Every Generation. Now, I think we can quite easily say this government is inflicting their version of fairness on every generation. I'm sure they're sitting there on the other side saying, why let just boomers suffer through high rent, high food inflation, and high crime? Under Liberals, the idea is let's be fair and make Gen X and millennials suffer as well. That is the Liberal version of fairness. Churchill commented, the inherent vice of capitalism is the unequal sharing of blessings. The inherent virtue of socialism is the equal sharing of miseries. And that's what Canadians are suffering under this government, the equal sharing of miseries. Now, I want to look at some of the sharing of miseries under this Liberal NDP government. We'll start with rent. We have a crisis across the country of skyrocketing rent. I read from rentals.ca a report. Average asking rents for all residential property types in Canada hit an all-time high of $2,202 in May, surpassing the $2,200 mark for the first time. That's up 9% from last year. In 2015, when this government took over, the average rent in Canada was $966. That's a 128% increase in rent. I don't think any Canadians have been receiving a 128% increase in their family income since 2015. Now, even adjusting for the out-of-control Liberal inflation, that's still 28% higher than the inflation-adjusted total compared to 2015. I want to talk about a couple examples across the country. Burnaby, BC, $2,500, up 8%. North York, average rent for one bedroom, by the way, $2,300, up 4%. Ottawa, $1,884 for one bedroom, up 7%. Kingston, $1,800, up 8.4% from last year for one bedroom. Now, luckily for the people in the prairie provinces, a lot of the prairie provinces have been spared the high rent increases, but no more thanks to this government. Calgary, one bedroom is up 6% from last year. Winnipeg, up 9%. Edmonton, my own hometown, up 16% from last year. Regina, up 16.7% from last year. Saskatoon, up 13% from last year for one bedroom. Fort McMurray, up 13%. That is the reality and the so-called fairness under this government. Fairness of access to misery is basically what this government has delivered. Mortgage payments have doubled since this government has taken over. Housing prices have doubled. I want to read a quote from Bloomberg, the business magazine. Canada is probably sitting on the largest housing bubble of all time. Not the largest housing bubble in Canadian history, but of all time. Inflated home prices in Canada are a result of easy money supplied under the government's monetary policy. At present moment, there is a risk in mortgage rates climbing, which we're seeing, as Canadian bond yields are dragged up, particularly at a time when debt-to-income ratios are sky high. Canadians, as we are aware, probably have the highest consumer debt-to-income ratio in the world. The worst part of a housing bubble is when you have a credit bubble underneath it. Again, we have such high debt-to-income right now. The amount of Canadian leverage into the system versus incomes is pretty astronomical, and we've seen debt servicing going up dramatically. There's definitely a risk here that if mortgage rates go higher, which they have, employment will rise, which it has been recently, then this thing does end up in a deleveraging cycle. And what does the Canada Mortgage Housing Corporation have to say on this topic? To quote, this year and next, 2.2 million mortgages worth over $675 billion will be facing interest rate shock as they come due for renewal. 2.2 million households. That's 45% of all households in Canada. our mortgage rates are coming up for renewal shortly. CMHC continues, most of these borrowers contracted their mortgages at record low interest rates and most likely at or near peak housing prices. So we have 45% of mortgages in this country, probably about the 1.5–2% mark, they're going to have to renew 5 or 6%. Mortgage shock, as CMHC calls it, leading up to hopefully not what Bloomberg is forecasting, which is a collapse in the housing bubble. Now, if we remember back in just July 2020, the Bank of Canada governor said, our message to Canadians is that interest rates are very low and they're going to be there for a long time. If you've got a mortgage or if you're considering making a major purchase, or if you're a business or you're considering making an investment, you can be confident rates will be low for a long time. Now, I think maybe Webster Dictionary needs to go out and update their definition of a long time to say that it's less than 4 years. And of course, we all remember the Prime Minister trotting out in front of his cottage for an interview when asked about the risks of this massive borrowing and perhaps rising costs to service it, said, of course, condescendingly, interest rates are at a historic low, Glenn. Well, guess what? They're not at historic lows. And if you wish to have an example of how out of control things are, how fast things can change, and how poorly planning this government is and how it hurts Canadians, the supplementary A's, which we debated just recently, they showed an added $1.9 billion of needed taxpayers' dollars to pay for interest on the debt. $1.9 billion more than their calculations they did just in February when they were doing the main estimates. Of course, the main estimates are, of course, the cash authorizations required for the entire year. That was done in February. Between February and May, when the SUP-As came out, interest rates were up $1.9 billion more than the government thought they would have to ask for in February. Now, you often hear this government talk about the Farmer Care Plan, which, of course, of 9,000 different available drugs in Canada, only covers birth control and diabetes. It's $1.9 billion for 5 years. If you think about that, just their mistake in February and what interest would cost Canadians on the national debt, they were off the equal value of their so-called Farmer Care Plan for 5 years. Now, taxes. This budget, there's $498 billion projected to be raised in taxes. That's up $166 billion from 2019 that they're taking from Canadian taxpayers. That's $216 billion more in taxpayers' money taken by this government since 2015, 76%. And that's up $50 billion from just 2 years ago. And yet somehow we have this government telling doctors, small businesses, farmers, they need to cough up a little bit more unless Canada slips into some dystopian hell. Again, $216 billion more than when the government took over. That's almost the entire, that's 76%. And yet if we don't get a bit more, the government, Canada will fall into dystopian hell. The Deputy Prime Minister, what kind of Canada do you want to live in without this extra few $billion? Do you want to live in a country where a teenage girl gets pregnant just because she doesn't have the money to buy birth control? So apparently, the last 9 years, they did have money to buy birth control, but somehow after $216 billion more in tax hikes against Canadians, now teenage girls are facing this. Interest on the debt, $291 billion for the next 5 years. That's equal to an entire tax haul when the Liberals came to power. If you think about that, just the interest for 5 years will be equal to our entire tax haul in the year 2015. I will end with another quote from Churchill. Socialism is the philosophy of failure, the creed of ignorance, and the gospel of envy. I think we can very easily substitute the word socialism with Liberal government when you look at this budget. Thank you, Madam Speaker.